The Pike County murders. A gripping true crime investigation. The night was quiet. Too quiet. A soft wind whispered through the trees, but it didn't feel right. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your skin, the kind that made your chest tighten. A low hum of distant traffic could be heard, but that was it. The small town of Piketon was still, unusually still. In the distance, a single light flickered in the window of the house that had been abandoned for weeks, the house that nobody dared go near. Inside, a figure moved in the shadows. It wasn't supposed to be there. Footsteps echoed faintly through the empty halls, and the creaking of the floorboards seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Every movement felt exaggerated. Every sound felt like it belonged to someone else. Something was wrong. The air inside the house was thick, damp with the scent of mold and rot. The light flickered again, casting a brief shadow over the darkened corners. The smell of dust and old wood filled the air, making the stomach churn. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath. And then there it was, a soft thud from upstairs. Slow, deliberate, the sound of something heavy being moved. The hairs on the back of the neck stood up. The pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed to run, but the feet refused to move. Who was up there? The answer came when the footsteps started again. Slow, steady, closer now. A faint whisper caught in the air. The house seemed to breathe. Suddenly, a door slammed open upstairs. Then silence. The kind of silence that made the heart race, thundering in the chest. It was too quiet, too perfect. And then a figure appeared at the bottom of the stairs. No face, just a silhouette, a shadow. The tension in the room was unbearable. Every muscle in the body froze. The figure stepped forward. The coldness in the air grew unbearable. It was no longer just the house that was holding its breath. It was the world. Every movement, every sound became unbearable. And then, in a flash, the figure lunged. A scream pierced the silence, but it didn't last long. The only sound that remained was the harsh, ragged breathing, and the faint rustling of the leaves outside. Moving like whispers in the night, the breath came in short, desperate gasps. The figure was still there, unmoving in the doorway. A cold sweat slicked the skin. The sound of footsteps behind echoed like a distant drum. But no one was there. A chill ran down the spine. The eyes darted around the room, searching for escape. But the house, was it alive? It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in. Every inch of the air felt suffocating. A muffled voice suddenly came from the shadows. Faint, distant, almost unreal. It was a whisper, but it wasn't speaking to the person standing there. It was speaking to someone else. A warning. Something was terribly wrong. The figure at the door shifted, just slightly. But it was enough. Enough to reveal the glint of something metal. A knife. The blade reflected the dim light from above. It gleamed, sharp and waiting. And then another noise. A sound that didn't belong. A door creaked open upstairs, then slammed shut. And the figure finally spoke. Its voice was low, guttural. "I know you're here," it said. "I know what you did." The words hit like a slap, an accusation. The air seemed to turn cold, as if the very walls were condemning. A shadow loomed larger as the figure took a step forward. The heartbeat quickened. The legs screamed for movement, but the body wouldn't listen. It was paralyzed. With every step the figure took, the shadows grew deeper, thicker. The light flickered once more, and in that brief moment, the room was bathed in darkness. Complete and utter darkness. Then a sudden crash. Something shattered. The sharp, violent sound of glass breaking. The figure lunged, and the breath was stolen away. A scream cut through the suffocating silence, but it was swallowed whole. By the house, by the night, by the darkness itself. The darkness felt endless. No light, no sound, only the harsh, frantic breathing, the air thick with terror. A sudden scuffle broke the silence. A foot stumbled across the floor. The knife, still gleaming, was within inches. Its blade caught the faintest glint of light. Closer, closer, and then a voice. Not the figures this time. A whisper, so soft, barely audible. From the corner of the room, a voice that seemed to come from nowhere. I'm still here. It froze everything. The chill in the air grew deeper. Something wasn't right. The figure seemed to pause, listening. For a moment, the world stood still. The footsteps shuffled, then stopped. The eyes scanned the shadows, searching, hunting. But there was no one there. The voice, who had it been? The feeling of being watched intensified. Suddenly, the air felt thick with the weight of 1,000 eyes. The silence was unbearable now. The figure shifted, moving cautiously toward the corner. But it wasn't alone anymore. A soft rustle. A shadow crossed the floor. Then a scream. A loud, desperate cry. Not from the one who had been cornered, but from somewhere deeper within the house. Somewhere it should never have come from. The figure turned sharply. The air crackled with tension. The knife still gleamed, but it was no longer just a weapon. It was a symbol of something darker, something deeper. The house itself seemed to tremble. The walls groaned under the weight of secrets buried too deep to remember. And in that instant, everything felt wrong. Like the house had always known. It had always been waiting for the moment when the past would return. The figure looked back, fear flashing in its eyes for the first time. But there was no escape now. Not from the house, not from the truth, and not from what was lurking within the shadows. The walls seemed to close in tighter. A low, rumbling sound echoed from deep within the house. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was something far darker. The floorboards creaked, like bones, shifting beneath the weight of the past. The figure stumbled back, eyes wide, the knife now trembling in its hand. Fear had taken hold, raw and unrelenting. The breath came faster, more shallow, and then there was movement. From the corner, a shadow emerged, slow, deliberate, like it was savoring every moment. The figure froze. The air was thick, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. The shadow moved closer, revealing more of its form. A man, gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow, darkened with something ancient. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The house, the air, everything seemed to hold its breath. The figure, trembling, took a step back. Another step. The floor creaked beneath, and the echo reverberated through the house. The man's eyes never left him. They were piercing, like they could see straight through the fear, through the soul. Another slow step. Closer now. The knife was raised. The heart was pounding, so loud, so fast, it almost drowned out the silence. And then the man's mouth parted. A single word. Run. The voice was rasping, hoarse, like it hadn't spoken in years. The voice was rasping, hoarse, like it hadn't spoken in years. But the warning was clear. The figure's legs moved on their own, desperate, frantic. But the house, was it letting him go? The floor beneath him groaned, and the door ahead loomed like a distant hope. His feet were heavier now, the air thicker. And then the scream. From upstairs. A woman's scream. Choked, terrified. It shattered the night. The figure froze. There was no time. The man's eyes locked with his again, and for a split second, everything stopped. A warning. A choice. The door was there, but the past wouldn't let him leave. And with that, the house seemed to hold its breath once more. The scream echoed again, louder this time. A desperate, frantic cry, that seemed to ripple through the very walls. The figure stood frozen in the doorway, caught between the past and the present, between escape and fate. The door beckoned, but his body refused to move. The shadows shifted again, creeping along the walls like dark tendrils. The house was alive with something ancient, something wrong. The man's eyes were still fixed on him, unwavering, as if he already knew what would happen next. And then the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening crash. The room was suddenly plunged into total darkness. No sound but the frantic beating of the heart. No escape. The figure's breath came in sharp gasps, the panic rising. The air was heavy now, suffocating. And then a rustling noise, far too close. A movement to the left. The figure spun, knife raised instinctively. But nothing. Only the cold breath of the house. A whisper. "I told you to run." The voice wasn't the man's anymore. It was something else. Something worse. A soft shuffle of feet. A soft, familiar sound. The figure's eyes widened in realization. And then the flicker of light. The same light, the one that had flickered above, was back. But this time, the shadow underneath it wasn't human. A shape. A presence. Something watching. The figure's breath caught in his throat. And then the movement came. Faster than he could react. The knife slipped from his hand as something heavy slammed into his chest. A gasp, then another. Pain. Cold, sharp pain. The figure stumbled backward. The air grew thick with the smell of blood. The body hit the floor, but the house, it didn't stop. It never stopped. The walls pulsed, as if drawing life from the blood spilled onto the floor. The shadows twisted and writhed, and above it all, the whisper. "You never should have come here." The last breath escaped the figure's lips, a final exhale into the suffocating darkness. And then silence. Total silence. But somewhere deep in the house, the sound of something moving, waiting, persisted. The past wasn't finished. And the house was never going to let go. The silence stretched on, endless. But it wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of something watching, something waiting. The house, now eerily still, seemed to breathe around the figure's still form. The shadows lingered, flickering with the faintest tremor. Then another sound, soft, a dragging noise, a heavy, slow movement. It was coming closer. The air felt thicker, as if the very walls were pressing in. And then a soft shuffle. The figure's body, lifeless, was no longer alone. A shadow crossed over it, blocking out the faint light. The presence in the room was unmistakable now. It was real. The faintest rustle of fabric. A whisper in the darkness. "I've been waiting." The words slithered through the air, heavy with malice. The house seemed to groan beneath them, as if it, too, was waiting for something. The dragging noise stopped. Then the cold air in the room shifted. A shape appeared from the darkness. A figure, tall and thin, emerging from the shadows like it had always been there. The skin was pale, almost lifeless. The eyes dark, empty. A hollow void. The knife, still on the floor, caught the faintest glint of light. It was as if the house itself had decided to reclaim it. The figure in the corner reached out slowly, fingers long, cold, and deliberate. And then, without warning, a low chuckle echoed through the room. A chilling sound. It was not the man's voice anymore. Not the figure's. Something much older. And the walls, they seemed to whisper back. They knew. They remembered. The house hadn't just witnessed the horrors. It had fed on them. And now it was hungry again. A door creaked open upstairs. The scream again. A woman's cry. But it wasn't the same woman. No, it was a new voice. A new soul calling for help. And as the shadow stepped forward, it seemed to swallow the last light in the room. The house, it seemed, had never let go. And now No one would ever leave. The shadows stretched longer, deeper. The woman's scream echoed through the house, distorted, warping as though the very air itself was suffocating the sound. A chill ran through the room, colder than it had ever been. The figure in the corner moved closer, each step deliberate, slow, methodical. It didn't hurry. It didn't need to. The floor beneath creaked with each movement, a groan of the house settling deeper into its dark, oppressive rhythm. The eyes of the figure gleamed in the darkness, empty, soulless. But they were still watching, and somewhere, hidden beneath the layers of the house, beneath its very bones, something stirred. A presence that had been waiting far longer than anyone could comprehend. The dragging sound started again, closer this time. Something was approaching, and it wasn't human. It wasn't anything that belonged to this world. The walls began to pulse with a sickening rhythm, as if the house itself were breathing, moving, alive in ways it shouldn't be. The woman's cries were getting louder, more desperate, but they came from upstairs, from deep within the house's heart, and something in the air shifted. The figure, still standing motionless in the corner, turned its head slowly toward the stairs. The pulse quickened. The presence in the air grew heavier, more oppressive. There was no escaping now. The doors were closed. The windows boarded up. The house had swallowed them whole. But it was not finished yet. Another scream rang out from the depths of the house, this time strangled, guttural. A new terror had awakened, its hunger insatiable. The figure began moving toward the stairs, its steps silent but sure. It knew what waited for it upstairs. It had been waiting too long to let anyone at all, escape. The whispers were louder now, merging with the crackling of the house's walls, filling the space with sounds of death and despair. A sharp, quick intake of breath echoed in the hallway. But it wasn't the figure. It was someone else. Someone who had just realized they weren't alone. And then nothing. Complete silence. The house held its breath. The shadows in the corner of the room lengthened, and the door to the upstairs hallway creaked open. Just a crack, the crack in the door widened, inch by inch, as if the house itself were inviting the figure closer. A faint, cold breeze swept through the hallway, carrying with it a damp, earthy smell. The darkness ahead seemed to pulse, as though it was alive, waiting. The door creaked again, louder this time, unnatural, as if it didn't want to be opened. But it opened anyway, slowly. The figure, its face obscured in the shadows, stepped forward. The air grew heavier, thicker. The silence now was absolute, pressing on the ears, suffocating. And then something shifted. A shadow, no, something else moved past the threshold. Not human, not even close. The figure stopped at the base of the stairs, every muscle tensed, every nerve on fire. The whisper came again, louder, as if the house were speaking directly into their mind. "You're not alone." A shiver ran down the spine, sharp and cold. Then, the first step. The staircase groaned beneath the weight, echoing down the hall like a death sentence. Each step seemed to take longer, as though the stairs themselves were fighting against the figure's movement. The woman's voice screamed again, echoing from above, raw with pain, but this time it was mixed with something else, something darker, a guttural growl that seemed to come from deep within the house. The figure climbed, one agonizing step at a time, and as it reached the top of the stairs, the air shifted. The shadows at the end of the hall seemed to reach out, creeping toward the figure. No longer just shadows. They were alive. And then the door at the end of the hallway opened, not by any hand, but by the force of something unseen. A cold, bitter wind howled from within. The woman's voice, no longer screaming, now moaned, pleading, "Help me." But it wasn't the woman anymore. It wasn't anyone. It was the house calling for more. The figure hesitated, A split second, but then something moved behind them. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the shadows. It was something far worse. And it was right there, close enough to feel it breathe. The figure spun, eyes wide with panic. But the room had shifted. The hallway had closed. And the door to escape, the last chance, was gone. They were trapped. And the shadows, now living, closing in, knew that the figure turned again, frantic now, heart pounding in the chest. Every instinct screamed to run, but the hallway had narrowed. The walls seemed to shift, pressing closer, squeezing the life out of the air. The shadows were no longer just darkness. They had substance, form. They slithered across the walls like snakes, creeping toward the figure with a sickening deliberation. The temperature plummeted. It felt like ice had spread through the bones, chilling from the inside out. And then, the whispers again, low, slithering. I see you. It wasn't the house this time. It was something else. Something that had been waiting far longer than the house had ever known. A figure, tall and twisted, stepped from the darkness at the far end of the hall. It had no face, only a void, a deep, endless blackness where a face should be. Its arms stretched unnaturally long, fingers twisted like broken branches, reaching for the figure. The shadows followed its every move, latching onto the walls, feeding off the very air between them. The figure's legs trembled, every muscle in its body locked in place. It couldn't move, a sharp, echoing hiss, like a breath drawn through a closed throat, filled the space. The tall figure took a step forward, its long limbs seeming to stretch unnaturally as it moved closer. And the whispers grew louder. You're part of us now. The words weren't spoken aloud. They were inside the mind, burrowing deep, crawling through thoughts like worms through soil. The shadows wrapped around the figure, cold and suffocating. It tried to scream, but the air was thick with the weight of the house, with the weight of everything it had consumed. It was too late. The figure felt the ground shift beneath its feet, and then hands, cold, clammy, and impossibly strong, gripped the shoulders. There was no escape. The shadows closed in. They covered everything, suffocating, swallowing, dragging everything into the darkness. The tall figure loomed above, its faceless presence a terrifying void. And then the light flickered one last time. For a brief moment, the house seemed to exhale, and then there was nothing. The figure was gone. The hallway was silent. But the house, the house asterisk, was not finished. It had fed again, and somewhere in its walls, deeper than before, something stirred. The whispers began once more, and the darkness grew, the silence stretched. But it wasn't comforting. It was heavy. The house, now still, held its breath. The shadows continued to pulse, as if they were waiting for something. Something more, and then a creak. A slow, deliberate groan from the floorboards. It started in the corner, farthest from where the figure had disappeared. A shadow moved, not a person, not an animal, a dark, undulating mass. The walls seemed to breathe again, exhaling a cold, oppressive air that filled the space, thickening with each passing second. The door at the end of the hallway shuddered, the faintest flicker of light escaping through the cracks, though the house itself remained shrouded in darkness. Another groan. This time, the sound came from deep within the walls, as though the house itself were stirring from a long slumber. The air was suffocating, closing in like a vice. And then a figure, a man, stumbling, his eyes wide with terror, emerged from the shadows. He didn't belong here. Not anymore. His hands were shaking, trembling uncontrollably as he looked around the hallway. His breath was ragged, his eyes darting from one corner to the next. He'd been through the house before years ago, but this time it was different. The walls seemed to breathe, almost as if alive. And he wasn't alone. From the darkness behind him, the faintest sound of dragging feet. Slow, steady, closer. His heart raced. The shadows on the walls twisted, and the house seemed to shift around him. The figure glanced back, panic flooding his chest. Nothing, no one, just the suffocating silence. But then, the air grew colder. The whispers began again. "I see you." The voice wasn't his. It wasn't anyone's. It was the house. The shadows closed in. Closer, closer. The man staggered backward, eyes wide with fear, heart pounding in his ears. The house was alive, and it was watching him. The dark figure emerged again from the shadows, but it wasn't just a figure anymore. It was something worse. It moved like smoke, shifting with an unnatural fluidity, a void, stretching out toward him. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the growing silence. And then the shadows converged. They wrapped around him, suffocating, pulling him deeper into the dark heart of the house. The whispers grew louder, louder still. "You will never leave." And the house, the house asterisk, swallowed him whole, just like it had swallowed the others. And the darkness deepened. The house seemed to hold its breath again, waiting, watching. The silence grew deafening, thick like a heavy fog that clung to everything. The man's figure vanished into the shadows, swallowed whole by the walls that groaned with hunger. But the house wasn't done. It never was. Deep inside, something stirred. The house, alive with its endless hunger, moved beneath the floorboards, shifting, twisting, feeding. Another figure appeared in the doorway at the far end of the hall. This one wasn't running. This one was different. She walked slowly, carefully, as if she had known all along what was waiting. Her eyes were dark, hollow, but determined. She didn't seem afraid. She had been here before. She knew the house. The floor creaked under her feet, and the shadows seemed to draw back, as if they were afraid of her. The whispers began again. "You shouldn't be here." But she didn't stop. She moved forward, step by step, as though the house itself had no power over her. The light above flickered, casting strange, unsettling shadows on the walls. She paused, glancing down the dark hallway, the silence pressing against her. The door at the end of the hall, the one that had once opened to something unspeakable, remained closed. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step toward it. The house groaned in protest, the walls creaking like ancient bones. She reached for the door. The air grew cold again, the temperature dropping so quickly that the breath she exhaled turned to mist in front of her face. Then something moved. From the darkened corner of the hallway, a shape emerged. A figure, not tall, not imposing, but familiar. A shadow, long and thin, shifting in the dim light. And the whispers, louder now, swirled around her. "You know what's in there." The woman's hand trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. She turned the knob slowly, deliberately. The door groaned as it opened, the space beyond impossibly dark. For a moment, there was nothing, just blackness, deep, endless blackness that seemed to stretch forever. But then, a flicker, a shape in the dark, a pair of eyes, a face that she recognized. And for the first time, her resolve faltered. The house knew. It had been waiting. And as the door creaked open fully, the last breath of silence was swallowed by the shadows that crawled forward, eager for the next soul to take. The house had never stopped feeding. It had only been waiting for the right one to come home. The face in the doorway was hers. But not exactly. It was twisted, changed. The eyes, hollow, dark, and deep with something ancient. It was the face of someone who had been claimed by the house long ago. The woman froze, her hand still on the door, her breath caught in her throat. The air in the room felt like it had thickened, becoming heavier, suffocating. The shadows around her writhed, twisting like living things, stretching out, crawling toward her feet. The woman took a step back, but the figure, her twisted reflection, stepped forward. It was not the woman she had been when she entered. It had the same eyes, the same face. But there was something darker now, something that didn't belong. She heard a soft whisper, but it wasn't from the figure. It was from the house itself, from the very walls around her. "Welcome back." The voice was familiar, but twisted. It was her voice, but distorted, broken, as if time itself had warped it beyond recognition. The figure smiled, a slow, cold smile that spread unnaturally wide, revealing teeth far too sharp, far too many. The woman staggered back, her heart racing, a sick realization gnawing at her. She had known it was coming. She had come to confront it, to face whatever lay hidden in the house. But not like this. Not this. The figure took another step forward, moving closer, the room growing darker with each inch. "Why did you come back?" The voice was both hers and not. The house never forgets. The walls groaned. The floor trembled. The shadows closed in tighter. She had been drawn back here by something she didn't understand, by a memory, by the house itself. The woman's pulse quickened. The air around her grew thicker, more oppressive. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to turn away, but her feet were glued to the floor. The shadows clung to her, pulling her back into the hallway, closer to the darkness. She heard it again, the faint dragging sound, this time behind her. Another presence, something watching her. She spun around and there it was, a shape in the corner, emerging slowly, impossibly tall. Its face was obscured in the shadows, but the outline was unmistakable. A figure familiar, yet monstrous. It had been here before. It had always been here. The woman's legs weakened. The cold, biting fear wrapped around her like chains. "Escape is not possible," the twisted figure said, its voice now filled with dark amusement. The walls pressed in further, the house expanding and contracting, shifting in rhythm with her heartbeat. The woman staggered toward the door, but the figure blocked her way, its face stretched into something unrecognizable. "You were never meant to leave," it whispered. The house's grip tightened. The walls, the shadows, they had all been waiting for this moment, for her. And as the door slammed shut behind her, the last light was consumed. She was no longer part of the world outside. She had been claimed by the house. And the house, it had just begun. The house hummed with a low, guttural sound, as if it were alive, feeding off the fear that now gripped the woman. She turned back toward the twisted figure, her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of inevitability pressing down on her. The walls felt closer now, suffocating. The house, it was alive in ways she had never imagined. It had consumed everything, every soul that had dared enter its dark, twisted halls. And now it was waiting for her to join them. The figure stepped forward again, its presence overwhelming, its face no longer resembling her own, only a grotesque parody, eyes wide with hunger. "Do you remember?" it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "Do you remember why you came?" Her mind scrambled for answers, grasping at fragments of memory. There had been a reason she'd returned, a promise, a need. She had to know the truth. She had to face the past. But now she was unsure what was real and what was just the house twisting her thoughts, distorting them. The walls began to close in further, the floorboards creaking as if the house itself was alive, moving under her feet. "No one leaves," the figure said again, its voice now layered with others, voices of the lost souls who had come before. She turned toward the stairwell, her feet heavy, her limbs slow. The shadows shifted, crawling up the walls like hungry creatures, watching her every move. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she slowly ascended the stairs. Each step felt like a struggle, the weight of the house pressing harder, crushing her will. Above, The air seemed thicker. A strange sound filled her ears, like muffled whispers from the deep corners of the house, urging her forward. Asterisk at asterisk is waiting, came the voice again, a low murmur like a cold wind in her ear. The house is alive, and it never forgets. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before her, darker than before. The door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, just enough to see the faintest sliver of light. But it wasn't safe. Nothing here was safe. She moved toward it anyway, the walls shifting as she walked, the shadows thickening with each step. The light from behind the door seemed almost like a lure, an invitation she should have ignored. She hesitated at the threshold, the door creaking open on its own, an invitation she could not resist. Inside, a single, dim light illuminated the room, but it was not a comfort. No, it was worse. The space was small, suffocating like a tomb. The room was filled with old, decaying furniture, broken chairs, shattered mirrors. And in the center of it all, a tall, dark shape stood, its back to her. It moved then slowly, as if it were sensing her presence. The figure turned, but it wasn't the same as before. No, it was something else. It had no face, just a void. And in that void, she could feel it, a presence, an ancient force, far older than the house itself. The source of everything. The house had fed on this presence, and now it had chosen her. And in that moment, as the void reached for her, she understood the truth. She wasn't meant to confront the house. She was meant to become it. The void in front of her seemed to stretch wider, deeper, swallowing every ounce of light. It was an emptiness that wasn't just of space. It was a presence, a hunger that gnawed at her very soul. She could feel it pulling at her, pulling her toward it, toward the heart of the house. The air grew thick, suffocating, and her chest tightened, as though the house itself was squeezing the breath from her lungs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. They were heavy, rooted to the floor, as if the house itself was holding her in place. The shape before her, the void, moved closer, and in that darkness, she could see it now. Not a face, not even a body, just emptiness. The house had become something more than it had ever been. It wasn't just a place of death. It was the vessel for something ancient, something older than time itself. And it was waiting. Her mind struggled to comprehend it all. The whispers of the past, the twisted figures, the faces she had seen, all of it had been leading to this. The void seemed to draw her in, the shadows wrapping around her, pulling her closer. "You belong here," the voice whispered. It wasn't just a voice. It was everywhere. Inside her mind, in her thoughts, in her blood. "You have always belonged here." Her heart raced in her chest, the beat echoing like thunder. The presence, the emptiness before her, it didn't need words. It didn't need to explain. It simply was, and she was part of it now. She reached out, her trembling hand hovering above the void, but she couldn't pull back. Her fingers brushed the darkness, and instantly, a cold shock shot through her arm, coursing through her veins like ice. The shadows gripped her tighter, pulling her into the very heart of the house. She gasped, but there was no air left, no escape, no way out. The walls pressed in, the floor began to crack beneath her, and the house seemed to exhale. And then, the darkness swallowed her whole. For a moment there was nothing, no sound, no light, no breath, and then, asterisk a new whisper asterisk. "You are the house now." It wasn't her voice. It wasn't anyone's. It was the house, speaking through her. Her body was no longer her own. She was a part of it, woven into its foundation, lost in the endless corridors of its dark heart. And as the house settled back into its still, oppressive silence, a final thought passed through her mind. It will never end. The house had consumed her, and in return, it would live on forever. The dark had taken her, just as it had taken all the others. The house, now darker than ever, seemed to pulse with life, slow, deliberate, as if it had just gained another heartbeat. Her body was still there, standing in the center of the room, but it wasn't her anymore. It was as if her very essence had been torn away, absorbed into the walls, the shadows, the floorboards. The house had claimed her, and now it felt fuller, stronger. The darkness around her thickened, coiling like a living thing, and it whispered, asterisk not to her, but through her asterisk. In the distance, the familiar sound of dragging feet echoed down the hallway, soft, steady, an invitation. The house had grown, but it wasn't done. It was hungry, always hungry. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder. Asterisk, you're part of us now. You are the house. Asterisk. The shadows in the room shifted, twisting like smoke, and the air was thick with a suffocating cold. And then, an unexpected sound, a door creaking open, faint but unmistakable. A new figure stood in the doorway. A man, his clothes torn, his face pale and gaunt, eyes wide with panic. He didn't belong here, not yet, but he would. The man's eyes scanned the room, wide with terror, his breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. The walls seemed to close in on him, as if sensing his fear, as if the house had been waiting for him. The whispers started again, but this time they were louder, more urgent. Come closer. The man hesitated. The house, like an animal, fed on that hesitation, that moment of weakness. The air seemed to thicken, pushing him forward, urging him to take another step. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet. Closer. He wasn't alone anymore. The darkness was there, watching him, waiting. The whispers rose in volume, swirling around him like a storm. And then, just as he thought he might escape, a cold hand gripped his shoulder. He spun around, but nothing was there. Only the shadows, moving, stretching. They had already claimed him. The house had begun its work, slowly, methodically. The figure tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. The house was full now. It had taken another soul. And as the shadows pulled him in, the walls sighed in contentment. The house would never stop. It had fed again, and it would continue to feed forever. The man's body trembled as he stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes wide with horror. The air felt thicker now, suffocating, as though the house itself were pressing against him. He could hear the whispering again, that same insidious voice that had haunted the walls for so long. It felt closer now. Come in, it urged, its words like an invisible hand pulling at his chest. He tried to step back, but his legs wouldn't obey. He felt as though the floor beneath him was holding him in place, forcing him forward. His breath quickened, panic surging through him. The shadows seemed to gather at the edges of the room, writhing like serpents, waiting for him to make a mistake.